Hi, I'm Bob Dover, and thanks for watching this technical module that continues my series on stream restoration in suburbia with some case studies from Columbia, Maryland. In this module, I'm going to be describing how the environmental benefits and adverse impacts of these stream restoration projects are analyzed, considered, and documented and disclosed to residents as required under the federal National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA requires that the adverse and beneficial effects of significant federal actions be analyzed, disclosed to the public, and then avoided or minimized or mitigated to the extent feasible. And there's three levels of analysis you'll see under NEPA for projects that are unlikely to have significant impacts. They will usually be evaluated through a categorical exclusion, which is basically just filling out a checklist. Projects that may have an impact, but those impacts are likely to be mitigated by other state and local environmental policies or requirements, such as control of stormwater during construction. Those things would likely be evaluated under an environmental assessment. And then for larger projects that actually will have adverse impacts that have to be evaluated and mitigated, the project would be evaluated under a more detailed environmental impact statement. Now, the purpose of NEPA is to identify and disclose these impacts to the public. And so how is that done? Well, first of all, the applicable categorical exclusion, or the EA or the EIS, discusses those impacts, and those are public documents. The public can review and comment on those. Then the project will have to apply for other permits, federal, state, local permits, and there will be permit applications, and those will require some associated documentation, other analytical reports, technical reports attached to them, and those will discuss some of these items. And then a public comment period isn't always required. It is required for an EIS. It's not necessarily required for an EA unless there's really substantial public interest, in which case the agency will probably go through a public comment period. But if they do go through a formal public comment period, then they will have to be distributing notices to the public and the stakeholders about that public comment period. And those notices will describe what the project entails, and it won't necessarily discuss all the impacts. It will discuss the resources that the agency intends to look at, what they seem to think some of the impacts may be, but the actual purpose of a public comment period isn't for the agency to tell the residents what's happening. It's more for the residents to be able to comment, and maybe they know of resources that the agency doesn't know about, or maybe they know specific issues of concern to the neighborhood. And so the public comment period is an opportunity for the agency to get that information from the residents and incorporate it into their analysis. And then there may be, outside of the official public comment period, other mailings, signage. The developer, may want to hold their own meetings, which is fine, with environmental groups or with homeowners associations, and that's a good thing as long as the information communicated is factual. The analysis in the NEPA documents must consider whether the project will actually achieve the objectives, the claims that it's being done for. Many of these projects are funded by federal agencies or funded by taxpayer dollars, and if it turns out that technically the purpose and need may not be achieved, or there's a good chance it won't be achieved, then that would be a waste of money. So there needs to be some discussion of whether it will actually be achieved. It must be based on up-to-date, readily available scientific information. You can't ignore scientific literature that you don't like, you can address it if you wish. You can explain why you think it's wrong. You can explain why you think it doesn't apply to your project. But this is readily available information on the internet, and if there's public interest in your project, and you're able to find it, well, the public's going to be able to find it too. So you may as well find it and address it up front rather than ignore it and make it appear that you're trying to hide something. Then you must consider the impacts of the entire lifespan of the project. I've seen documents that really just try to discuss impacts during construction, and but then don't discuss what is happening after construction, and what is the duration of the impacts and how long do they last. And you're also required to quantify project specific impacts wherever you can. And so, for instance, in the stream restoration world, if you're cutting down a forest of 50-year-old trees, it's very, very easy to quantify the duration of the impact. It's 50 years. If you're cutting down 50-year-old trees and then you need to replace the ecological and the hydrologic functions of those 50-year-old trees, it's going to take you 50 years to grow the new trees to replace those. For stream restorations, at least the ones in Colombia, the permitting framework has been under what's called a nationwide permit, NWP 27, and having issued this NWP was a federal action, so it required analysis under NEPA, and that was done using a document called a programmatic EA, which I'll explain in a minute. And that document was most recently renewed in 2021. And then under that umbrella permit, individual projects can propose to be included under that umbrella permit, which is fine. But if they do so, they must conform to the permit itself. The permit itself has conditions, so the project must comply with those conditions. It also must fit within the framework of the programmatic EA. So the programmatic EA evaluated projects within a certain envelope of parameters, and your project must fit within that envelope of parameters. Otherwise, it doesn't conform to the PEA. And then there's other applicable Army Corps of Engineers guidance, checklists. The state environmental departments will have their own guidance and checklists. And so the individual projects are required to comply with all this stuff. Now, under NEPA, again, the entire purpose is to communicate project information to the stakeholders and the residents. And it must provide that information. There must be an opportunity for meaningful review and comment. And that must happen before project decisions are reached. And too often I've seen agencies go ahead and do projects without any notifications or any public comment period at all, and that's a violation of NEPA. Or they will go ahead and reach the decision, we're going to do the project. They'll go through the design, they'll go through the permitting process, they'll go through contracting with the contractors, and they'll get right up to ready to start the project. And then they'll post a few signs saying, oh, by the way, we're doing a project starting next week. And that's not a legitimate notification to stakeholders under NEPA, because it doesn't give the residents a meaningful opportunity to review and comment. What is a programmatic EA? So I explained that an EA is done for any action that, based on the experience of the agency, the technical experts there, they've already done a bunch of these projects. They have a pretty good idea what they involve, where they're going to be done. They already have an idea that they really won't have any significant adverse impacts that can't be mitigated. The mitigations are usually standard things that are required under other state and local environmental permitting requirements like stormwater management during construction that will mitigate most of the impacts. So, that's the category under which an EA can be done. Now, a programmatic EA, a program, is defined as a set of similar individual projects. And so, for instance, with stream restoration, they all generally involve the same types of physical activities. They all generally take place in the same type of environmental setting. They all have the same typical size, etc. And so instead of doing a standalone analysis and document of every single project, because there's hundreds or thousands of them, you can package, what is a typical project and just evaluate the impacts under what's called a programmatic document. And it's not site specific, it's not location specific, it won't mention your specific project, but it generally evaluates the class of projects to see whether there's impacts. Now, what are the flaws and limitations in the specific programmatic EA for NWP 27? So I've been managing NEPA projects for, 25, 30 years. And I've written programmatic EAs, I've written programmatic EISs, I've worked on projects that are covered on these programmatic documents. So I have a pretty good idea of what they involve and what is required under NEPA. And I've reviewed the programmatic EA for NWP 27, and I found what I think are flaws and limitations. So in the next few pages, I'll go through those. First, the analysis assumes upfront that the purpose and need will be achieved. It does mention that there are some researchers who have some questions about this, but after it sort of mentions that, it doesn't come back to it. It actually states, quote, authorized activities will, not may, will improve the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the aquatic environment. So it doesn't leave any room for the possibility of what if a project doesn't achieve that? And what happens then? Because these projects are very destructive. So if you go and if it turns out that some of these projects will not actually achieve this, yet the destruction has occurred, what are we left with now? We're left with the destruction and none of the benefits. And then the second problem is this phrasing, physical, chemical, and biological characteristics. Well, that's great. That's language that is straight out of the Clean Water Act, and which should be driving all these projects. The problem is that on a project by project basis, all three of these characteristics are not enforced or even monitored. There is no requirement for measuring water quality, the chemical parameter. It's not done before the project is constructed. It's not done after the project has been constructed. The same with biological and ecological detailed surveys and investigations. So there's no documentation that a project has taken an area that is deficient in its chemical and biological characteristics and has improved those. You can't show that there's improvements if you aren't actually doing measurements. Far too often, people claim success on these projects based on a visual inspection, which isn't science. And they do some monitoring of the physical elevation, the stream bank stability, but that's easy. The physical modification of the stream is easy to accomplish. You go into the watershed, you cut down all the trees, you get bulldozers, you push around the dirt to decide where you want the stream to be. You throw some rocks on top of it to try to stabilize it in place. The physical modification is very, very easy, but The more recent studies since about 2014 show no link between this physical modification and chemical or biological improvements. And this is a real problem because the stream restoration companies know this. So for instance, within the past few weeks in Maryland, the state legislature has passed a new law that defines the word ecological restoration. And they defined it as improving physical, chemical, or biological characteristics. Well, isn't that convenient? Because the stream restoration companies know that they can do the physical part. They also know they can't do the chemical and biological, but if they dumb down the requirement to physical, chemical, or biological, then they can find a way to comply with the law, but it's a bastardization of the law, and they're not really meeting the requirement of the Clean Water Act, and they're also not meeting this requirement that is specified in NWP 27, which is and. So NWP 27, the PEA, also, this is a problem with EAs in general. Typically, they will evaluate only regulated resources. So for instance, some wildlife species and vegetation species are covered under the Endangered Species Act. So they're regulated by other federal laws. And so EAs will typically sort of look at impacts to these regulated resources, but they won't really look at impacts to unregulated resources. For instance, the impact on you as a homeowner is unregulated. And so they won't necessarily have to evaluate the visual impact on you, the noise impact on you, the impact on recreation, the impact on general wildlife and habitat that isn't included under the Endangered Species Act. And that is mostly how NWP 27, the PEA, operates. It really doesn't consider in detail the unregulated resources. It does mention visual impacts and makes the remarkable statement that stream restoration impacts on visual aesthetics will be beneficial. And there may be places where streams are so degraded in urban areas that maybe an effort to go pick up garbage in the stream and generally clean it will improve its visual aesthetics. But in suburban areas and rural areas, people tend to like their trees, and they like them because they want a view of trees from their home, and they want places to go do recreation. And so by concluding that project impacts on visual aesthetics will be beneficial, the PEA completely ignores the fact that people will deliberately pay premium prices to buy a home that has a view of trees. Similarly, the PEA, in its discussion of noise impacts, only discusses construction. So yes, during construction, the bulldozers make noise that's heard for miles around, and that is an adverse impact on residents. But as soon as construction is done, they turn off the engines, they take the bulldozers away, and now that noise impact has stopped, and therefore that impact was only temporary. Well, people who live adjacent to these stream restoration areas in these narrow tree buffers know that trees are marvelous attenuators of noise. So if you have houses that are separated from a highway or from industrial activities or car repair shops by a narrow ribbon of trees, or maybe they're even just separated from, one row of houses is separated from another row of houses by a narrow ribbon of trees. If you take those trees down, now those houses are exposed to noise from the other side. And that will continue as long as it takes those trees to grow back, which is going to be decades. So this idea that increased noise will only occur as a result of the construction is false. it will absolutely continue decades later. And the same thing applies to the visual aesthetics. It's not just people want a view of trees. People don't necessarily want to see what's on the other side of the trees. They don't want to see the highway. They don't want to see the car repair shops. They don't want to see their neighbors hanging out on their decks. They don't want the lighting from the back of one house to be obtrusive to a house on the other side. So this all just ignores impacts on residents. Um, and the PEA assumes that these effects are limited to the area immediately surrounding the activity, and that just is false. The visual impacts will encompass the entire viewscape, which may be a half mile or a mile or more. The distance that noise travels may be even further, and the PEA completely ignores these issues and just sort of addresses that maybe, right there, right on the edge of the project, there may be impacts, but outside of that, there's no possibility for impacts, and that's just wrong. So along that line, the PEA did not consider the duration or the permanence of impacts at all. It assumed that all adverse impacts are only during construction and therefore temporary, and they failed to quantify that when you do mature tree removal of a large area, now you've adversely impacted habitat, ecological function, hydrologic function, visual aesthetics, noise, recreational impacts, and those impacts will last for decades. And they also didn't consider the possibility that if the project, the stream bank stability objective of the project is not met, then they will be having to send crews back out to do the construction all over again. And this is not hypothetical. We're currently experiencing that in the Longfellow neighborhood in Columbia, where they finished construction in 2020. And now in 2025, they're about to send out crews to basically restore the same stream because the stream bank stabilization objectives weren't met and they have to fix it. And that possibility is not addressed in the PEA. One of the big things in the PEA is that it did not consider project size at all. And again, I've worked on a bunch of these, and I have literally never seen a PEA that did not have acreage limits or size limits. That is the entire purpose of doing a programmatic assessment. If there's thousands and thousands of projects that require a permit, and most of them are just small projects and aren't going to have any impacts, then you sort of want to find a way to separate the large projects that really will have impacts from the hundreds or thousands of projects that won't have any impacts at all. And so the way you do that is with acreage limits or size limits, and you set aside the small ones that don't really need a whole lot of thought to them, and you go ahead and expedite those approvals, and then you set aside the big ones using this acreage limit and take a more detailed look at the big ones. That's the entire purpose. Well, the programmatic EA for NWP 27 acknowledges this by coming out and saying the acreage limits in the PEA will ensure that there's no impacts that are more than minimal. And that makes sense. If you're setting aside all the small ones, then you can say we've evaluated all these small ones, none of them would really have any impacts, and by making sure that any project considered under this nationwide permit are of about the same size, don't exceed a certain size, then as long as they all stay within that size limit, then there's nothing to worry about. That's delightful. The problem is, even though the PEA says that acreage limits will make sure there's no impacts, the PEA does not actually have any size limits in it. And it's not just that I reviewed it and I didn't find any. The PEA actually has a sentence that says this PEA does not include any size limits or acreage limits. And so that's actually a contradictory statement that I think invalidates the entire EA, because it's saying there is a condition under which these projects won't have any impacts, but it doesn't force the projects to consider that. And the developers know this, so they're starting to propose projects that are larger and larger and larger because they know there's no limit. But the PEA acknowledged that the bigger projects could have impacts, but they don't stop those larger projects. The PEA doesn't consider a project's contribution to potential flood hazards. It states that there is a condition that the pre-construction course, condition, capacity, and location of the stream cannot be changed, and therefore there will not be any flooding hazards. However, it also goes on to say, however, if you're improving ecological function, aquatic function, then all bets are off and you can modify the pre-construction course and condition and capacity all you want. Well, this is problematic because, again, if these projects don't actually achieve that aquatic improvement, the PEA is assuming that if somebody comes in and modifies the pre-construction course and condition and capacity of the stream, then they could actually be increasing flooding hazards. And so there's a serious problem here that the document acknowledges that the projects as designed could increase flooding hazards. Another major problem is that the public-facing documents, such as the notices of the public comment period, the decision documents, there's a requirement under NEPA that the documents available for public review must avoid the use of technical jargon, acronyms. They must be understandable to laymen, residents who aren't in the industry and don't necessarily know what's being discussed. Well, this is a serious problem because the stream restoration industry has not only invented their own jargon, but the jargon they've invented is highly manipulative. So, for instance, I recently reviewed a public notice for a project that discussed that the methodology to be used was the natural channel design method. And even the word stream restoration uses one of those physical, positive sounding terms. And neither of those actually tell the residents what actual physical activities are going to occur. Telling somebody we're going to do a natural channel design in your backyard doesn't tell them that we're about to cut down all your trees. And there's no way that they would know that. And the only way to make this statement without the technical jargon is to release these documents and make them actually say, this project will be accomplished by cutting down X acres of trees in the following locations. And then the public may start paying attention to them once they realize, yeah, oh, that's what this means. And then by using the words natural and restore, well, that's deliberate obfuscation, because there's nothing about these projects that is natural, and there's nothing about these projects that is in any way restoring the stream or the watershed to some past condition. That's simply not happening. But they sure sound great, and it would be hard to object to that. So I believe that the NEPA documentation on this particular project and on others that uses these phrases without actually saying in plain language, cutting down trees, substantial grading of the surface in the entire floodplain, things like that, is deliberately manipulative, and therefore I think it's illegal under NEPA. So do these flaws have any actual consequences? Well, the answer is of course they do. They result in projects being approved that aren't going to achieve the purpose and need. They won't be successful in achieving stream stability or ecological restoration or water quality improvement. These projects are going to inflict significant and unnecessary adverse impacts upon both natural resources and stakeholders such as local residents. These projects are increasing flood hazards, and if these projects don't achieve stream stability, then they are a waste of taxpayer dollars. And a lot of these larger projects should be evaluated in more detail under project-specific individual permits, not under the nationwide permit. And now the flaws in this analysis flow down to the project level and to the community as a whole, because once NWP has these flaws, then the individual permit applications for the individual projects also have those flaws. If the NWP says, don't worry, there's no impacts, then the individual permit applications are going to say the same thing, and they do. And then the notices of public comment period that get sent out to the residents are going to say the same thing, and they do. And then the developer goes out into the community and makes their own presentations, which are basically nothing but sales pitches, and they include the same manipulative language. And in the end, you end up with a community that is somehow thoroughly convinced that these projects are great. We all want to be environmentalists, and the way the language of these projects is presented allows us to all sleep well at night thinking we are all being environmentalists. But we really don't know that we've been manipulated into thinking these projects are going to be successful, that they're beneficial, that they're natural, that they're restoring something. And we're unaware that they're going to have adverse impacts and unexpected long-term costs because nobody is telling us that. Some recommendations, there's not a lot we can do under NWP 27 as it currently is. Projects that have already been done, all we can do is try to hold the project owner accountable for the damage they've done. Projects are still being considered and proposed under NWP 27, and there can be community activism or potential legal challenges to try to stop MDE and the Corps of Engineers from authorizing new permits when they do things like use technical jargon that's not understandable. And then NWP 27 is up for renewal in 2026. And as I pointed out to you, there's things in it that are not simply a disagreement among technical experts. There's absolutely things in it that are blatantly false or internally contradictory that if this EA had ever been challenged by somebody, I think there would have been a good chance that it would have had to been modified. And so I look forward in 2026 to maybe being involved in trying to force some changes to the programmatic EA. So thanks for listening to this technical module. I hope you have a better understanding of NEPA and have a better understanding how the process is being manipulated in order to generating public opinion in favor of these projects that are as destructive as they are. So thanks, and I hope to be recording other technical modules.